Hello, and welcome to your professional development on BIPs and crisis plans. Let's start out by asking, what is a BIP? A behavior intervention plan is a written plan designed to address specific behavioral challenges by identifying problem behaviors, their functions, and the strategies to promote positive behaviors and reduce problem behaviors. This is why we do an FBA. An FBOA is a great way for us to gather data so that we're making data based decisions when we're creating that behavior intervention plan. The most important thing at the beginning here is for me to remind you that all the information, the links, the resources that I'm going to share with you today can be found on eCPPI. If you click on this box right here, it will take you to eCPPI, and you can also get to it through the internet. This is a wonderful resource for any questions that you might have for anything EC and documentation. Let's start with creating the BIP. So, in this situation, as you're following this full professional development, you have already finished your FBA and you are working toward creating that behavior intervention plan. Let's talk about the initial plan. What you may start with is some surveys to gather some choice. And I'm going to show you those right now. So here on the left-hand side, you can see a picture of a forced choice menu with pictures. This may be used for some of our younger students, but this also may be used for some of our students who do not have necessarily the capability of making decisions or independently answering a forced choice like you might see on the right-hand side. So this is a more adapted version of the forced choice. Let's take a look. So every single time you click on one of these links, it's going to either prompt you to make a copy or it's going to be a PDF and you won't be able to edit it. So you'll see as we're going through each of these links that it's going to be prompting me to make a copy. But let's take a look at this. This forced choice menu is going to come with directions. So if you read these directions, it's going to say that in order to identify possible classroom reinforcers, it's important to go directly to the source, namely the student. Below is a paragraph that sets the stage for you to complete the early childhood forced choice reinforcement menu using an interview format with preschool and early elementary school children. Please read the paragraph aloud to the student and then proceed through the choice item menu. So if you are giving this forced choice reinforcement menu, you are going to read that paragraph first, and then you're going to go into the delivery of the forced choice that is adapted with pictures. I want you to bear in mind that this is just an example. If you have some suspicions or you have some input from previous teachers or parents on things that a student may like, you should add these to your forced choice reinforcement menu. So if you know a student might like Legos and Skittles and you want to see which one they like more, that's just an example. But this is how you get to know the student and you really get to know the reinforcers. If they like Bluey and they like The Lion King, let's figure out which one it is so that we can make a reward out of a song or a small clip from a show. That is totally reasonable. You might put reinforcers like Play-Doh, or do you like I don't know, doll time. These are things that you might find in your classroom. If on this forced choice menu, you see a high five from a teacher and play with a toy by yourself, but you're not really cool with giving high fives, that's kind of a weird example, but you're not really cool with giving high fives, then you don't want to put high five from a teacher on your forced choice. So that is just an example of some different ways that you can adapt this for your student, or you can totally just use this as is. But for a lot of our students, being the line leader doesn't have really any significance. So choosing a high five from the teacher and being a line leader, there may not be a choice. That might be two things that they don't really understand or value. So this might not be a forced choice specifically that you would use, but this is a great example of what it might look like. This is a great example here. We see free time on the computer. A lot of classrooms do not have Chromebooks and do not have computers. You might want to change that with free time on the iPad. So those are just some examples. On the right-hand side here, you see a forced choice reinforcement menu that is a little bit more advanced. This is going to have longer sentences in it. It's going to require a lot more independence, but You're still going to read them the directions. Let's suppose that you have worked hard on an assignment and you think that you've done a super job on it. In thinking about the reward for your effort, which one of the two things below would you like most to happen? And then you can read those items for them and you can X off what they say. They can do it independently. This can be a really great tool for a force reinforcement menu for a more advanced student who has some receptive and expressive language skills. Let's talk about the BIP itself, right? So we found those reinforcers, and that reinforcement menu was also included in the FBA. So if you've completed the FBA, that is actually built in to the FBA itself. So you'll already have that information. Let's talk about the behavior intervention plan itself. Here you see a copy of a BIP. Obviously, at the top of this, you're going to put the student information, the school, the case manager name, but then we're going to move into what I find to be a little bit more of a tedious process, right? But it's worth it. And you get most of this information from your FBA. So doing the FBA is not necessarily more work, right? You really have to do the steps of the FBA in order to make an informed BIP. And once you're done with the FBA, you know that you can make an informed BIP with confidence and make sure that it is data driven, evidence based. So the targeted routine would go at the top, what you want them to do, the desired behavior, what you want them to do, and the consequence or outcome. You want to include the setting event, the antecedent or trigger, the problem behavior, the replacement behavior, and then to decide the consequence and the function of that behavior. These are all things that you are going to get from your FBA documentation, and you should be able to pull them pretty quickly. Next, you're going to go into a little bit more detail. You start out with the setting event strategies. So in the setting event strategies, you are going to input that information from your FBA document into this section. So any event strategies that you might use in the setting itself. Manipulative antecedent to prevent the problem and prompt replacement or desired behavior. So, how are you going to prevent the problem before it happens? When you're doing your ABC data, it's very important to really focus on that A in this section because you need to know what's happening before the behavior and what you can do to stop that or prevent the behavior. So, if an antecedent is every time the bell rings, Johnny has a self injurious behavior, one of the preventative practices might be making sure that Johnny has headphones on before, or noise canceling headphones before the bell rings, or Johnny has a visual prompt to let him know that the bell is about to ring, a timer. There are preventative things that you can do to stop that behavior when you know that the antecedent is the bell ringing. Can you stop the bell from ringing? No, you cannot. That is a setting event that exists and you cannot change. So part of the goal here in the behavior intervention plan is to acknowledge that and talk about what you can do to prevent the problem behavior. Then we can talk about some prompt replacement or desired behaviors. What do we want him to do? So the preventative and the prompt replacement are sometimes confused, right? Because you could say that using the schedule would be the prompt replacement, right? But it's also the preventative problem behavior. We want to have that in place, and that would be what we do to prevent the behavior, but we want him to use it, and that's the replacement behavior. So if Johnny isn't using the timer, then it's just a preventative problem that behavior or to prevent the problem behavior, and it may not necessarily be working. So when you talk about the things prevent problem behavior, these are the things we're going to be trying to try and prevent that problem behavior. And then the replacement is going to be what we want them to do instead. Of course, we would like for Johnny maybe to make the transition with a preferred object, or maybe Johnny needs to be making the transition after the bell rings with a preferred adult. These are replacement behaviors that can replace that self-injurious behavior that we do not want, that we want to avoid. So that would be an example of that first column being manipulation through the antecedent, trying to find the antecedent and circumvent the behavior before it happens. The next column says teach behavior. Explicitly teach replacement behavior and desired behavior. So underneath this, you're going to say teach replacement behavior. What are you going to teach instead? What we're going to be teaching is appropriate transitions without self-injurious behavior. What we're going to be teaching is anticipation of sensory overload or loud sounds that might occur in a regular environment. Teach desired behavior or academic and social skills. This is where you're going to really focus on how it's impacting, let's say, the academic performance or social performance. It is not socially appropriate for a student to be self-injuring every time a bell rings. It does impact academics because it makes it take away from academic time. And we'll talk a little bit later about some data collection that you can use specifically for academic time lost. But those are some examples of ways that it impacts, and how are you going to teach that desired behavior? Some examples might be social stories, right? Social stories are a great skill, a very underused skill, often suggested but not always implemented. And social stories can really be a fabulous tool in helping to teach appropriate or desired behaviors and decrease maladaptive behaviors. You can make social stories extremely personalized. We have access to symbol sticks through the News to You suite. And on symbol sticks, you can actually create your own social stories. You can use pictures that are real pictures actually uploaded of the student or the environment. You can get as creative as you like. You can draw out a social story. Whatever you do to give them access to an explicit teaching of the desired behavior, that is what you need to do in this situation. You can also talk about wraparound services here. A taught desired behavior might be support from the social work or the school social work. You can bring in other people. You can bring in the speech language pathologist to give you some of those visual supports that you might not be thinking of. It's really important to know that this BIP is a team effort. That's why we talk about it during the IEP and we meet as a team, all the stakeholders involved, because you might need support from OT, from a sensory standpoint. You might need support from PT, from a gross motor standpoint. Anybody who's involved in the care of the student should be involved in this behavior intervention plan. All right, the next column is the after consequences. To reinforce replacement and desired behavior, redirect and minimize reinforcement of the problem behavior. So, how are we going to reinforce behavior and desired behavior? These are the ways that we're going to do it, right? So, you might have preferred tasks, right? Things that they can work toward, things that they can look forward to, things that don't necessarily happen if they, do not perform the desired behavior. For example, a natural consequence is a great example of this. If Johnny is having self-injurious behaviors and it takes him about 5 minutes to be able to come down from those self-injurious behaviors, and then he has to transition to his next classroom, let's say in middle school. When he gets to that next classroom, he might find that he is not going to get as much warm-up time. Maybe the warm-up time is a benefit, something that he enjoys. The warm-up time might be yoga or something relaxing those first 5 minutes of class. He's going to lose out on that time, and that's a natural consequence, and that's something that needs to be explained to Johnny. If he loves PE or he loves art class, but he is having self-injurious behaviors that result in maladaptive behaviors, that are taking away 10 minutes of that time, he's going to lose 10 minutes of art and 10 minutes of PE. It's important to explain those consequences or the repercussions of actions that are natural. It's not a punishment, it's something that happens as a natural consequence of the behavior. So I think a lot of times we think of the word consequence and we associate with punishment, and that is not what a consequence is. A consequence is just something that happens after a behavior. And this can be a negative thing, it can be a neutral thing. It's rarely a positive thing, though. And we want to make sure that our consequences to positive behavior are very clearly defined as opposed to our consequences that happen during negative behavior. So that consequence, that series of consequences I just gave were examples that can happen after a negative behavior. Some examples of something that might happen after a positive behavior, for example, if the desired behavior is that the student will use a calming strategy like deep breathing, let's say that they use that deep breathing strategy or they reference a social story, something that you have taught to be a replacement behavior. So deep breathing, using a timer, social story, a preferred object for comfort, headphones, headphones, noise canceling headphones, anything that you might be teaching as a replacement behavior, if they implement that, it is okay to give them a reward for that. So, when you see a student gradually growing in their development and decreasing in maladaptive behavior, it is really normal for there to be a transition phase where they're trying to use a coping mechanism or a replacement behavior, but they're not quite there yet. If a student attempts to cope or attempts to be able to complete this transition appropriately, it's important to recognize their growth in that so that they can recognize it in themselves, because sometimes full completion of an entire transition can be very daunting because it's hard to really quantify for a student. But if you help them by scaffolding that task or that type of transition, it can make it a lot easier. So let me explain that to you. If the transition consists of, we might think one step, right? Go to art. You have to break it down into less than just go to art, because we have before the bell rings, we have while the bell is ringing, we have after the bell rings, we have the walk to art, we have the cool down and arrival at art. There are multiple steps. And if you break those steps down into a work system, that can make that work system more palatable for a student. And then you want to reward every time they are able to complete one of those steps. So let's say you have a coping mechanism at the beginning. You have something to get ready for the bell to ring. So you see that Johnny is putting on his noise canceling headphones. It's important to give Johnny a star or give Johnny a high five or give Johnny a little snuggle, something positive for him, a positive verbal prompt like, great job putting on your headphones, Johnny. That's a reinforcement. That is for desired behavior, right? So you're reinforcing, great job putting on those headphones. I'm going to give you a gold star in our step. Let's say he gets to the next step. The bell rings and we don't have a self-injurious behavior. Fabulous. It's currently ringing. Great job. The bell is ringing and you are not freaking out. You are doing so great, not having self-injurious behaviors. However you want to say it, give him another star. He did the second step in his process. So you get it. Reinforce as you go. And if the whole task is too much, and it probably is, or else it wouldn't be a maladaptive behavior that you're doing a BIP for and that you've done an FBA for, if you need to break it down and talk about in this BIP how you are going to reinforce every single step until you get your desired behavior. So here's your desired behavior. Student will earn blank if they get 80% or more points of their daily point card. That's just an example. So something I might write for Johnny is Johnny will earn, and let's say we learned in our survey that we did, Johnny really loves visiting Miss Roberts or something like that. Science teacher loves her. He loves to go see Miss Roberts and get a high five. Or he likes to go to Miss Roberts' room and get a starburst, right? Student will earn 4 or more stars in their work system for transitions, and then they will get the desired incentive of going to see the teacher, Miss Roberts, or going to get a starburst from Miss Roberts at the end of the day. Now, you might start off with completing one transition, right? But you want to grow that into something more globalized. So he might get to go get a starburst and get a high five from Miss Roberts after one work system, but he might have a bell change 6 times in a day. You're going to have to start with 6 bell changes. That's how behavior management works. So he might be going to get high fives from Miss Roberts and get a starburst 6 times a day. Okay. We are at the BIP stage in this intervention, right? We need to get this behavior under control and we need to get it adapted because this behavior is impacting his academic instruction. It's impacting his access to the educational environment. It might be impeding the safety of him or others. So this is important. So we need to put the time into it. So you might start with 6 work systems, but the goal is to eventually keep going down. Maybe it's the first spell of the day and the last spell of the day he gets a high five and a starburst. Maybe you move into just the last spell of the day. He's going to get that starburst, but he's got to earn those 5, 5, 5, 5, 5 all the way through. You might change it into every time a bell rings and he completes a whole work system, that's 1 star. You do it again, you get another star. You do it again, you get another star. And at the end of the day, you have 6 stars. You go get to see Miss Roberts and you get a high five and a starburst. The ultimate goal is that you're getting through a week. You're getting through a month. And then it becomes such a regular behavior that you have modified this behavior and you can either move on to another behavior to target, or that was the only behavior that really needed to adjust. And you have successfully completed a behavior intervention plan. So I know that was a lot of information, but I want you to understand the long-term goal of this. This is not just something that you write, you set and forget. That's not what you do here. This is an actual plan to intervene on behavior. You want to make it as detailed as you can. You wanted to put in here everything that you're going to try. When you're first making a behavior intervention plan, this is everything that you're going to throw at the wall to try and make it work. And as you modify this behavior intervention plan, as you meet, because you will re-meet about every 6 weeks to revisit the BIP and discuss what's working, what's not, what do we need to change? Is nothing working? Are all these things working and we can discontinue the BIP or go into a maintenance mode for it? This is an ongoing document. A BIP should not be taken lightly. You have gone through the FBA process. You are currently intervening on behavior. You need to continue to support this BIP. It's a very important document. Behavior is a functional skill. So it's one of the most important things that you can do in this educational environment is teach our students to have adaptive behaviors and have socially appropriate behaviors and be able to access that academic environment. So I'm going to get off my soapbox, but let's keep going with this process. That was a really important slide. The BIP is something that is often misunderstood and misused. So it's really important that we put a lot of emphasis on how to create a BIP and the importance of a BIP. Creating the BIP. So you start off with an evaluation plan. And a lot of this, like I said, if you are doing that FBA, you are going to have all of this information. But it's important to also document it here so that you can really synthesize what you've looked for. So now evaluation plan. You start off with that behavior goal. What is the short-term behavior goal? And you're going to say exactly what I said at the very last slide or the last section column of that BIP. During blank, when blank happens, student will, what's the positive behavior? At least blank percent of the time as measured by a daily point card. Let's make that specific to Johnny for our example. So during transitions, when the bell rings, Johnny will transition appropriately at least 75% of the time as measured by a daily star chart by so-and-so date. And I like to put that 6 weeks out because that's the next time that we're going to revisit. And you'll just continue to push that 6 weeks out as you go. What is the long-term behavior goal? So the approximate desired behavior. Now, it might be during transitions when the bell rings, Johnny will transition appropriately from class to class 100% of the time as measured by his daily star chart. So you have to decide what the long term is, what maybe a year from now will look like. And then you also have to decide what your short term is, and that's going to help you create that BIP. Is the BIP or is the plan being implemented? So complete that daily implementation checklist. And we're going to talk about different ways that you can data monitor on the BIP a little bit later. Is the plan making a difference? And make sure you're graphing that data and who's responsible for it. So this is just a document that you are going to complete when you do the BIP. And it's really going to say who's responsible for what, how is it being implemented, and is it working? And you want to make sure that you revisit this plan every time you revisit the BIP. You might be changing that expected date for the short term. You might be changing that expected date for the long term. This is a living document. You want to create a new one every time you do the BIP check or you do the recheck on the BIP. But this is just holding everyone on the team accountable. And every time you do the BIP review, 4 to 6 weeks is the suggested BIP review meeting. You are going to do a new one. Make sure you have a facilitator, admin, the implementing teacher, another implementing teacher if that person exists, so maybe a TA who's also responsible, the parent, and any additional team members. BIP review meeting. So I keep repeating this. So when it comes to the review, you are going to revisit that BIP itself, and you're going to revisit the BIP review meeting plan document when you do that. So let's take a look at that so I can be a little bit more detailed here. So essentially what you're doing here is it has the agenda. You're going to review the daily implementation, so the data from the BIP. You're going to review each task on the BIP. For the implementation plan form, and then you're going to complete an implementation rating based on how successful it is. You decide whether to monitor, modify, or discontinue. That's really important because if the student is making no growth, we're going to have to make some changes to the BIP. If they're making some growth, you're going to want to keep monitoring the BIP. So that's the difference between the modifying and the monitor. If it is a year out from the BIP and they are consistently performing this task analysis or whatever you've created, they are achieving this goal consistently, it might be time to discontinue that BIP. You want to document those actions and tasks in the table below. So every time you do the BIP, you're going to document it below. There are probably going to be 3, 4, 5 of these during the life of this BIP. That's okay. You're going to see gradual growth, right? You might start off modify, and then you might slowly move up to monitor. And then hopefully the ultimate goal is to move to discontinue. The agenda also includes review student progress data, summarize and document decisions on the actions below. So you're going to review the graph daily student progress data, and you're also going to document the actions and tasks taken below based on that data. Everything we do with this BIP is data driven, from the FBA that starts the BIP to every single BIP review meeting that you have. Everything needs to be data driven. We are constantly taking data on this BIP. It should become so second nature that you're not even thinking about it. A BIP takes a lot of data to continue. This is a very data-driven document. It's a data-driven process. We're going to talk in a moment about different types of data tools that you can use to monitor this BIP. But right now we're just talking about this review meeting and what that's going to look like. So the data summary, you're going to ask yourself again, is the plan being implemented with fidelity? Do we have a sufficient amount of data for decision making? So that would mean at least 80% of the data points, yes or no, and be honest about that. If there's a reason it's a no, then talk about it in the evaluation decision. Like, you have got to be honest about this. Maybe you are down a staff member and it has been the two of you and you have 12 kids in your class and you are only performing the data collection at about 60% of the time. So that's when you say, okay, team, we need to find a way to be supported, right? We need more support. He needs help during transitions. Do we have any additional staff members that can support us and help us with this data collection? Or maybe he's being supported through the transitions, but that individual is too overwhelmed or underprepared or undertrained to take the data, right? So these are things we actually have to ask ourselves, because if a plan isn't working, there's probably a reason it's not working, and it might have to do with fidelity. Is the plan making a difference? You might be completing the plan with fidelity, but it still might not be making a difference, which means that the team might need to revisit the parameters of the actual behavior we're modifying. We might need to take a step back and find a more functional behavior than what we're doing. If we're talking about transitioning being the behavior, but we're making no growth on it, even though we're implementing our BIP with fidelity, we might not need to talk about a more regressed goal for the student. This might be too lofty for them. And then you're just going to rate. So the document changes and additions to the original implementation plan. You're just going to put the task on here. Like, let's say we've been doing this BIP and we're not making the growth that we like, but we're making a little bit of growth. And we're seeing right at star number 3, Johnny is able to put those headphones on. He's able to get that star 1. The bell is ringing and he is not having self-injurious behaviors. But on star 3, when he is having to actually transition, we're seeing those self-injurious behaviors and we're seeing a fallout at that time. We might need to not focus as much on that antecedent that once existed where we thought it was the bell, more of a sensory support. We've mastered that. He's doing that consistently. We might need to start focusing on 3 and the actual transition to the class. Maybe all along we were just never getting to the transition because they were being set off by the sensory of the bell, but we didn't realize that the transition itself is also causing maladaptive behaviors. So it's a discovery process. The task might be to Continue to reward for the first and second with stars, but really focus on some tools and strategies for transition itself. Making sure the student knows where they're going, they have access to a visual schedule. This is something that you guys are really going to need to collaborate on as a team, because while we're talking about data and the BIP itself, there are endless possibilities for ways to intervene on behavior. Here is the implementation plan. So let's talk a bit about this BIP intervention or implementation plan. So, what's important when you're doing the BIP in intervention implementation plan, that you are discussing all of these topics. So, you want to start with that prevent and prompt, make problem behavior irrelevant. So, that antecedent intervention. So, we talked about some of those antecedent interventions. We can use noise canceling headphones, we can use a timer. We can't stop the bell. I purposely I picked this hypothetical because the worst thing is when someone picks a hypothetical that is not challenging, right? I don't know how else to say that. If I said to you like, "Oh, this student is triggered by another student throwing a chair at them and we need to make sure that the students are separated. We can move the student to another classroom." Great. That's something that you can fix without a BIP, right? I'm sure you can figure that out. We're talking about a student who is triggered by a bell going off, and there is no world where we can stop that bell. So we are using preventative measures that are actually within our control. So we talked about timers, we talked about noise canceling headphones, we talked about social stories. These are some things that are you are using to prevent. Teaching that replacement behavior and the skills to engage in the desired behavior. What does that look like? You're making sure that you're teaching, and all this is going to be on the BIP, right? So we already talked about what each of these things are. This is the process of saying who's responsible for this. It might be classroom teacher, OT, SLP, whoever it is. Who's responsible for this? And let's rate how they're doing. Are they doing it? Yes. Are we doing it kinda? Or are we just not doing it at all? And typically what we find is that when something is not effective, there might be something that we're missing, that we're doing kinda, or we're not doing at all. Where we usually see the fallout is not the prevent and prompt. It's not the teaching. It's not necessarily reinforcement, although sometimes that is where we see it. It's the redirecting to the replacement behavior. So, prompting the replacement behavior is the earliest sign of a problem, right? So, prompting that replacement behavior is so important. Sometimes we get to the reinforcement and we're like, oh, great job, great job. But we're not necessarily foreseeing what's going to happen, or we need a replacement behavior. We can't just say, like, we're just going to keep giving you treats for doing the right thing. Eventually, we're going to have to teach them what the right thing to do is. So, let me give an example of that. The wrong thing to do is the self interest behavior. Chances are the student knows that. That is most likely a communication that they are using, that they've used in the past. It works for them. It's not like he has to self injure every time he does this thing, right? It's not an impulse. It's a communication, most likely, right? That's the most reasonable assumption. And we do have to make some assumptions in this process. So, if he's communicating to you some kind of distrust or a desire not to do something, why doesn't he want to do it? Is it that he doesn't want to go to art? Well, no. During the FBA, we found that he really enjoys art. He really enjoys the place he is once he's there. You can see it in the data, right? He has a gold star at the first one, gold star at the second one. He falls out at the third one, but then once he gets into art, he's fine, right? And this is just a hypothetical. But you need to use that data to say, okay, are we teaching a reinforcement, a replacement behavior for the transition itself? This is where we're seeing a problem. What are we going to do as a team to fix this space? We're really honing in on what the issue is, and it's the transition itself. Do we allow the student to transition at a different time from their peers? Do we completely accommodate that situation? That might be a possibility. He may be overwhelmed by all the students in the hallway. We have to try some replacement behavior. So, a replacement behavior might be waiting until all the students exit the room, giving ourselves 2 minutes before we transition, and then moving into a transition. It might be that we get to carry a preferred object during a transition. It might be that we get to transition with a preferred adult or a preferred peer. These are things that we can try, but we need to make sure that we are actually giving a replacement behavior and not just waiting it out and seeing if eventually the student will transition and then we'll give them a skittle or we'll give them a high five. We can't always wait for the desired behavior to just appear. We have to teach that replacement behavior explicitly so they know what to do. And then you also want to make sure that you're rating the minimizing the reinforcement of the bad behavior. We do not want to reinforce that problem behavior with attention. We want to make sure that we are not reinforcing that problem behavior and not get, and I hate to use the word giving in, but if we know that a high five from Miss Roberts is the reinforcement behavior for the positive behavior, you better not bring in Miss Roberts for a high five just to get the student to calm down. You have to have a clear divide between what happens when positive behavior occurs and what happens as a consequence when a negative behavior occurs, such as a natural consequence like missing time in art or a natural consequence such as maybe feeling a little bit of embarrassment as a middle school student when you are falling out in your classroom. That's a natural thing. We cannot change those things. Those are natural ways of the world, right? So but it is our job to provide those redirections and those replacement behaviors so that we can teach a student how to be successful, not just reward when they are successful, and not just allow natural consequences to do the work, because they're not always going to do the work for us. This is something that's really important on the bottom too. So the implementation of supports who and how. We want to make sure that we are providing training to the implementers. So demonstration, practice, feedback. If you are tasking an individual with implementing this behavior intervention plan, you need to train them on how to do it. You can't just assume that someone's going to pick up that BIP and know exactly what to do. You want to make sure you're providing implementation feedback. So make sure that you are reviewing the data with the implementer and they are synthesizing the data with you. Because a lot of times you can look at a piece of data and it can mean one thing to you, but something completely different to the implementer. So something that might be independent for you might not be independent for the implementer. They may not have a knowledge of the hierarchy of prompts. They might not know about response time. It's very important to make sure that they have the training that they need to make sure that they are taking data that you can actually use. We recommend that you're doing that daily or at least 3 times a week. And then back to the behavior intervention plan. Now, I'm not going to pull this up again. It's exactly the same BIP as before. But when you are reviewing the BIP, you want to revisit the BIP. The BIP may not change. You may be in maintenance mode. You may just be monitoring and getting to a certain, let's say within the student's goal, it was like they need to do this over 6 consecutive months before we start talking about removal of the behavior intervention plan, or a year, whatever it may be. You may be in a maintenance stage of the BIP, but you do need to revisit the BIP every time. Now, when you review the BIP, when you revisit the BIP, you might make lots of changes, right? You may find that nothing is working. The social stories are setting him off. Like it might just be a whole teardown on the BIP. But the thing about this stage is that you know more at this stage than you did when you were making the BIP. So if you made a BIP and you are finding that just nothing is working, you're not seeing a decrease in these behaviors, then you know more than you did when you made it. Because when you made it, you thought that these measures might impact the behaviors. You learned that they didn't. Okay, this is a part of the process. This part can be a little bit frustrating, but that's okay because you're here. You're now. And it's time to start brainstorming on different types of interventions that you can do. Maybe changing the desired behavior to be something that is more obtainable or manageable for the student, making it smaller, chunking it, scaffolding. These are things that you might need to do. Transitioning might have been too much. Globally transitioning might have been too much. We might need to walk back to say, okay, we just need to work on putting our noise canceling headphones on. We can't even get ourselves to do that. We need to work on having a countdown timer that tells us when to put our noise canceling headphones on. Let's just come back to square one. Social stories about noise canceling headphones, timers to implement those noise canceling headphones, something desired like stickers on the noise canceling headphones to make them more desirable. You might need to go back to square -4. Now you started at square one, but you might need to scale all the way back. It's a living document. That's why we revisit the BIP. Now, here's what's more likely. More likely than nothing working or everything working is some things are working. We're like in a little bit of a stage where we need to make some adjustments because we're finding that the social stories are working, and he's getting to that stage 2, and he's getting all the way out into the hallway, and he gets to hallway B before he just falls out in the middle of the hallway, and this is consistent every day. Our data is showing he's turning the corner and he has fallen out. That's data. You're going to have to make some changes. It might be that whatever you're using to reinforce him to get halfway down the hallway isn't working all the way down the hallway. It might be something where he is losing sight of a preferred adult and he hasn't yet gained the sight of another adult. These are real things. Like, the things that I'm saying to you are not things I'm making up. These are real things that I have seen happen, that have surfaced through data collection and observation, especially when it comes to the implementer, right? So you might need to do something where the teacher in question, who's a preferred adult, walks you all the way to the corner, and then at the other corner, you see that other preferred adult, your point B, and they're waving you on so that you can make it to the other corner. Think of these things as temporary measures. They are interventions that you will slowly pull away. Is it completely easy for the art teacher to wave at the end of the hallway and get that student down the hallway? No, no, it's not. It's not easy, but it's an intervention. We have to know that implementing that intervention now is going to result in the eventual ability to remove those scaffolds, remove those supports, and that's the ultimate goal here. So when you're revisiting that BIP, it might change, it might not change, it might change a whole lot, it might change a whole little. You have to make sure that it is a database decision. Every time you are reviewing the BIP, you're going to do another evaluation plan. So you're going to go to that evaluation plan, you're going to fill it out, you're going to rate it, you're going to possibly change some things about that short-term goal, maybe change some things about the long-term goal. How's it going? Is the person that's responsible changing? Did we maybe have a person in place who was triggering these behaviors, and we had to switch out that person because we need somebody to help the student obtain their long-term goal? And while maybe in the future they might do it independently or with that other person present, right now they're a trigger and it's not working. Okay, let's talk about data collection for the BIP. So there are many, many ways that you can collect data for a BIP. And I'm just going to give you a couple examples. So join me on this journey as we look at some different ways that you can collect data for the BIP. This example here is a point card. So in all of our examples that I was reading to you, you heard me say point card in like the example sheet, right? My particular little dude wasn't using a point card. He was using a star system because he needed those happy little stars, and that has been something he's used for a long time. It worked for him. That's just my little Johnny. Johnny uses a star system. Let's say your kiddo can use a daily point card. This is a great and easy way to make it very visual for the student if they're taking ownership of it, or make it very easy for the implementer to take data. It's pretty self-explanatory. This is a scoring card. You're going to use a new one every single day. This is a great one for bell changes. But the expectation is going to be reducing the problem behavior and increasing expected behavior, and then reducing problem behavior, increasing expected behavior, use of replacement behavior, or approximation of desired behaviors. So you are going to be scoring that in the scorecard. And this is a great way to really have something you can graph and look at when you're looking at that BIP review and trying to figure out what works and what doesn't. You might know that during the week of these scorecards, you tried this thing and it was just low points across the board. You tried something different the next week and all of a sudden the points increased, right? So you can say like, okay, this intervention, it influenced growth, right? It impacted growth. So that would be a great reason to try it again the next week. Let's say you get a couple more points the next week. Okay, this is working. Okay, the week after that, it plateaus. it's the same amount of points. The week after that, same amount of points. Okay, we might need to throw something else into the mix because this was working, but it's not necessarily impacting growth now. So you have to use this data to really influence your decisions. Over on the left-hand side here, you can see some other examples that are a little bit more simplified. This one has a schedule in it, so keep on track for a good day. This one over here is very understandable for the student. So did not display class disruption, smiley face, did do a class disruption, little frowny face. It's really important to create something visual where the student can understand when a behavior is maladapted and when a behavior is positive. Make sure that the positive behavior is understandable and explicit. So for me, did not display class disruption. That's the way to do it. It's not the way that I would do it. I might say that instead of did not display class disruption, I might say did one participation or was engaged for 11 minutes, like whatever it is. Like for me, I might make it a little bit more tangible than did not display classroom disruption, but this is a really easy way to just take the data very quickly. So even if the student is not seeing this, it's still an easy way for the implementer to use a visual schedule to go ahead or a written schedule to go ahead and take that data. The one on the bottom, the keep on track for a good day, I think of this as one that is for the student to look at. It's very visually rich. It has the times on it. It makes it so that they can give a 0 or a 1. They can take points on like, did we do the targeted behavior or did we not? Did we do the transition or did we not? Did we do the transition in math? Yes. Did we not? No. And that helps the scorekeeper or the implementer say, okay, we are doing it during math and literacy pretty consistently, but when it's time to go to specials, it's a no pretty much across the board. We are not following teacher directions. We're not keeping our hands in ourselves, whatever it may be. So the target behavior would be on the side and the time of day and the scoring would be to the right there. Another example of a data collection tool would be the frequency tracker for the entire day. And let's go ahead and take a look at this. And I know these are a little self-explanatory, so I don't want to berate them, but I want you to have access to all of them. So in this presentation, you are going to have clickable links to all of these things that you can access these data tools on the ones that specifically work for you. But this is just another example of a frequency tracker or something where you might say you have the whole week here and you're actually putting the amount of times that a behavior occurs. So if a student is engaging in pinching of the teacher, you might say during math on Monday, we had 6 pinches. Tuesday, we had 4 pinches. Wednesday, we had 2 pinches. Thursday and Friday, we had no pinches. You can use that data to be, pretty clear that over the weekend we have a regression and on Monday we start engaging in those injurious behaviors again. What can we do on Monday preemptively, like maybe a social story in the morning, maybe switching up something in our rival to be a preferred task, letting them know that on Mondays, if we get through math with no pinches, we're going to go ahead. We're going to give Miss Robinson a high five. You're going to get a high five. You're going to get some positive praise and be consistent in your reinforcers when positive behavior occurs. Be consistent in the consequences when a positive behavior does not occur, when we do not make it through math and science. That's a conversation, and make sure you're having these conversations. We don't want to be tracking these behaviors and implementing a plan without including the student in the plan. This is not something to trick them. It's not something where we don't want them to know that we're doing it. This is something where we want the student to have ownership and awareness of the fact that, like, this is what we're going to do. This is the replacement behavior. This is the behavior that we're replacing. This behavior cannot happen in school. It is not safe. It is not happy. It is not fun. We do not feel good. We're in our red zone when we're pinching. We're in our yellow zone when we're pinching. We're in our green zone when we are playing with Play-Doh, when we're playing with counting bears, when we are getting to interact with Miss Robinson and get our starburst. That's a green zone. And the only way you can be in the green zone is when we're making these good choices. Data collection template, so a duration. The only difference about this from frequency is this is the amount of time. Rather than pinching, that might be a frequency, right? How many times are we pinching? But this might be an occurrence such as the self-injurious behavior. Let's say that maybe we're not seeing the frequency of the self-injurious behavior decrease because of our intervention, but maybe we're seeing the duration. Maybe self-injurious behaviors used to take 20 minutes and we would have to get multiple adults involved for safety of the student. Maybe we had to do a restraint for student safety, like maybe they needed to have their room cleared. Like those are things that the duration might be decreasing. Like maybe when the bell goes off, they have a self-injurious behavior that lasts 30 seconds. Like maybe they're scratching their arm for 30 seconds or pulling their hair for 30 seconds, but then they stop. That means that the intervention is working. Do we need more intervention? Yes. Might we need to adjust the intervention a little bit so that we can completely eliminate self-injurious behaviors? Yeah, we do. But we're seeing improvement, and we're seeing that while we might not be seeing the behaviors disappear, we're seeing maybe the duration decrease, and that's important as well. Another data collection template, and I hinted on this earlier, so I want to talk about it now, is the loss of instruction time template. This can be done on a Google Sheet. If you click on this, it will let you make a copy and you can take this and use it as your own. If a student is losing instruction, so like in our example, I'm going to keep going back to Johnny. Every Tuesday, we get this fallout, we have the self-injurious behavior, but also we're noticing that this student is not getting to access the first 15 minutes of art. You want to go ahead and document that. If Johnny is in an elementary school setting and it's not related to the bell, and every time we transition from snack to math, we are going into a full out self-injurious behavior lasting maybe 13 to 18 minutes. You want to make sure that you're documenting how much time of instruction they are losing. It shows the impact of the behavior. It also shows if this is the data template or the data tool that you're using, as you're putting in interventions, are we seeing an increase in time lost? Are we seeing a decrease in time lost? That's a great way to monitor and collect data to show if an intervention is effective or not. This is an example of how you can chart and progress monitor the frequency and duration data. So essentially what you're going to do is you would take a goal, you would put it in here, you would have the dates where the actual occurrences are. So let's say, just an example, we're doing the pinching again, right? And you're seeing that on Monday, this is the same example I just gave. Monday, you have 5 pinches. Tuesday, you have 4. Wednesday, you have 2. Thursday and Friday, you have 0. This is going to chart that frequency of the targeted behavior. So you can say, like, look, we're consistently seeing this across the board. A spike on Monday, a dip through the week. A spike on Monday, a dip through the week. Or maybe it's a spike on Wednesday and it's dip in the other days. And Wednesday is the day that they leave early for the ABA, whatever it is. You're going to start drawing conclusions based on your data. That's called synthesizing your data. And it's what we need to be doing with this data while we're informing our BIP. Let's talk about a crisis plan. Crisis plan is very important. What is a crisis plan? A crisis plan is an accompanying document for a child who may have behaviors that escalate to an emergent level. The team can include the parent, or the team including the parent would discuss the crisis plan. Let's take a look at this crisis plan. Very important. If you have a student, for example, Johnny, who we've been discussing, who is self-injurious, or a student who is maybe on a sliding scale of injury, like they might start off with pinching themselves and they might escalate to pulling out their hair and they might escalate to trying to stab themselves with scissors, right? That's an escalation that would have a scale of the emergency level of the crisis plan. But the crisis plan is going to show absolutely everything that you do in response to a behavior that is emergent, dangerous, for a student, for their peers, for adults in the room, anybody involved. If there is an emergent situation, we need to have a crisis plan on how we're going to address it. So you describe the behaviors that constitute an emergency situation. That might be a student engaging in self-injurious behaviors or injurious behaviors toward adults. So adult targeted aggression, peer targeted aggression. You put that in here. What does it look like? Describe the pattern of behavior that requires the emergency intervention. For example, if your emergency intervention is to remove the students from the classroom, okay, that's a response. If your emergency intervention is to put the student in a CPI hold for their safety, That is a response. What has to happen in order for that response to occur? Has the functional behavior assessment been conducted? Have you done an FBA? I certainly hope so. If you are making a crisis plan, I hope that you are in the process of an FBA or you have already done one. We might know the antecedent. We might know what causes this behavior. We might be very aware that this behavior occurs every single time we transition from snack to something else, but we have to transition from snack. We can't eat snack all day. We are working with our BIP to try and address this behavior. This is actively being intervened on, but it doesn't change the fact that we can't snack all day. Has positive behavior interventions or support plan been developed? I hope that you're saying yes when you're making this crisis plan because that would be your BIP. Describe in detail the preventative intervention procedure. So you're going to see that a lot of this is pulling from the FBA, it's pulling from the BIP. We should have these things in place. How do you respond? But we still need to have a crisis plan, right? We're working on intervening on these behaviors. We're going to detail what works, what doesn't work, what we're currently trying. It's going to be in the crisis plan, but at the end of the day, we really need to describe what we're going to do when an emergency occurs. How are we going to de-escalate it? What are some strategies that we're using? Are we using seclusion or restraint? We're going to describe in detail the role of the parent and the student in the plan. So when do we call the parent? When we escalate, and this is where I like to put a scale in here, sometimes 1 through 5. I might not call the parent at 1, 2, or 3. I might be using restraint or seclusion at 1, 2, and 3, or probably not 1. 1, let's say 1 is going to be a redirection. 2 and 3 might be a restraint. 4 might be a seclusion. 5 might be when we call the parent or crisis. You need to decide what that scale is and what the parent involvement is. When does the parent come to support? When are they going to come pick up the student? When are they going to come de-escalate the student? When even are we going to just call the parent? I've had students where when they get to a 3, that's when we call the parent to see if we can avoid the parent coming to pick up the student. And then when you create this crisis plan, you want to make sure that the stakeholders are involved, parents are in agreement, admin is in agreement, the implementers are in agreement. Who's going to be doing the CPI hold? Make sure they're signing here, they're putting their names and they're dating it because a crisis plan is something that we review and we agree on. It's very important that we do this because when we are implementing a plan during an emergent situation, we need to make sure that all stakeholders are in understanding that if we get to a 5 and we cannot contact the parent, that is when we are going to be calling 911. We're going to be calling crisis because this has become so dangerous that we need to get somebody else involved. We are not equipped to handle the situation. We need a parent to understand that if we couldn't contact you at 3 for a de-escalation, the next step is going to be a restraint or seclusion. Everyone needs to be in agreement on what the process is and what the crisis plan looks like. Thank you so much for attending, and I hope this was very helpful for you.